Hello there! My very first CNC machine just arrived in the mail today, and while I was trying to find some more videos online, most of them came directly from the manufacturer. So, despite my lack of experience, I thought a review of the 3018 Pro Max kit from a beginner's perspective might help at least one person out there evaluate the purchase. Starting with the unboxing here, we have the user manual, and I'll speed up the footage here in a moment, but I figured it'd be useful to show exactly what came with the kit. Now, one thing I can say from the get-go that did concern me is how damaged the box was that it came in, but spoiler alert, it ended up working in the end. This pouch here seemed to contain the motherboard, as well as some nuts and bolts for assembly. The next layer of the kit had some cables in it, the power cable, e-stop button, USB cable, those are the clamps, the Z probe, the cullet assembly. I think those are some bits there. And then the spacing tool there for assembly. And that's the other part of the cullet. In the cardboard box is the power supply. The 500-watt spindle. A ruler. The offline controller. Some more cables. And I did like how the frame came mostly pre-assembled. Now, the assembly itself went pretty smooth, the instructions were easy to follow, but one thing I did notice with the aluminum extrusion bed was that there were some sharp burrs left over to look out for, as well as some metal shavings that were left behind. Now, the most challenging part I found with the assembly of the kit was trying to put the cullet assembly onto the spindle. I found that the diameter is made for quite a tight fit, and one thing that the instructions didn't mention was the amount of force that was required. I ended up having to use a rubber mallet to try and tap the thing on. Once assembled, it was time to set up the machine to run, and I ended up using Easel as my software to generate the G-code. The software itself I found pretty intuitive and easy to use. The only issue I had was I forgot to set the RPM for the end mill bit, so I ended up crashing it into the workpiece on my very first attempt. Thankfully, however, the e-stop button worked. Just gotta remember to reset it after using. Now, once again here, I'll speed up the footage in a minute as to not waste too much time, but the process itself was pretty easy. I ended up selecting material, entering in my dimensions, selecting an end mill bit, and the nice thing about Easel is it gives you a little preview on the right-hand side of what it looks like. You can also press the simulate button, and that'll give you a little preview of what the G-code path looks like for the end mill bit to follow. There I'm selecting the cut depth. And then finally I'm pressing the simulate button to look at what the G-code path looks like. Here is my test piece of wood. Again, I entered the dimensions into Easel and I generated my tool path. Now it's time to clamp it down. And speaking of clamps, I found these clamps an absolute pain to use. They're also just slightly too tiny to clamp down a 2x4, meaning working with thicker pieces of material, not a fun experience. And now before running the machine here, I'm just setting the start point to the front left corner to match what the start point was set in Easel. Now, I didn't see anything in the instruction manual regarding the Z probe, so I didn't bother using it, although I suppose I could probably find information if I looked online, but it wasn't required since I could just use a piece of paper to slide underneath and make sure the bit was right above the surface of the material. For the offline controller, the biggest thing I didn't like was that the USB port was Type-C, so I couldn't use any of my thumb drives, and that ended up meaning I had to get an SD card reader in order to insert it into the offline controller. But once the test piece is clamped down, my origin point is set, all I have to do is select my file and load it up. And this time around I was very happy to see that the spindle was actually moving. Now, one thing I noticed after the job was finished is that the spindle kept moving. And even after exiting out of the file, the spindle kept moving. So I'm not sure if that was something with the controller, or if that's something to do with my G-code. But that wasn't a huge deal since I can just switch the machine off before moving my piece. Now, speaking of test piece, here's a look at the test piece. Considering I've adjusted none of the settings, left everything on default with a 1/8 inch single flute end mill, I'm pretty happy with the results. In closing thoughts, despite the few annoyances, I'm overall pretty happy with the machine. There were no major deal breakers, and the biggest issue I did have, with the end mill crashing into the workpiece, was all user error. But that did give me an opportunity to test out the e-stop button, and thankfully I found out it works. The biggest thing I like about this machine was just how easy it was to assemble and get running despite having no experience. In total, I'd say it took around a full evening, and that was from assembly to running. And of course the machine worked, which is the most important thing. In the future, I'd love to try some aluminum, but in the meantime I got a couple of wood projects that I got to get working on. Thank you for watching.